Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield. We're very glad right now to be joined by Martha Dimitratou, who is the founder and executive director of Repro Uncensored, the global nonprofit documenting systemic online censorship affecting sexual and reproductive health, abortion, LGBTQ plus communities, sex worker-led initiatives, and feminist organizations and activists. Through Repro Uncensored, she also leads cultural initiatives and movement convenings that bridge art, technology, and advocacy. Martha, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Very, very glad to have you here. Folks might also recognize that we've done some collaborations with Repro Uncensored on Instagram. So, and if you haven't checked that out, you can follow us at Project Censored and Repro Uncensored at Repro Uncensored. That's a lot of censored. Okay. But I do want to start with censored reproduction information because that's literally in the name of your org. And I know that in 2025 alone, Repro Uncensored documented over 240 censorship cases, and 2025 research by the group Censorship found that 95% of women's health and sexual well-being creators had experienced content moderation issues. 95%. Many respondents reported repeated takedowns, labeling of factual posts as adult content, and opaque moderation decisions with no clear path to meaningful appeal. So there are a lot of layers here. And I think it's absolutely worth noting that at a time in which it seems the bulk of the ruling class are being outed as pedophiles, it's vital for youth to understand things like consent, to be able to talk about their bodies, about autonomy, safety, and boundaries. Of course, even just outside of sexual assault and trafficking, there's the issue of just like understanding anatomy and what our bodies can and will do, understanding urges and not feeling shame around them. I recall a study in Sweden where I grew up that showed that adolescent girls were experiencing trauma in their first sexual encounters because online porn had given their male partners a very twisted and often violent portrayal of what sex is and should be. So, Martha, starting off here, could you walk us through some of this censorship that you're seeing around sexual health and well-being, and what that really means for people who don't have better places to access it? Particularly, unlike Sweden, in the U.S., we don't have proper sex ed, and there is a gross dearth of clinics where people can just walk in and get information and tools.
Yeah, cut me off if you have any questions, but I would say that as you know, there is, because of the legislations and the laws in the US, but also worldwide, and because of just the nature of how digital we've been, there is more and more people searching for information online, more and more, women, and there is, as we've seen, more and more censorship happening, which is obviously a massive problem. So, I often like to think that there is, or we say that there is people who are actually actively seeking for, let's say, abortion care right in the moment. And then, it's just communities that need to know about the information and the options that they have, right? So the first category will be more like, let's say, Google and search, other search forms, and now AI, right? Like ChatGPT and whatever other people are searching for information, and people's awareness, sharing, and so on would often be social media. So everything is censored in one shape or another, in different shapes or forms. So the ways that we see censorship happening, say, on social media are, a few different ones. So there will be entire accounts being taken down. We see this often happening around major political moments, whether that was Roe v. Wade or, like in Poland, when the legislation came, we see like a crescendo of accounts being taken down. We also see like ad accounts. So say that people want to like say, hey, there is this option of getting abortion pills online. We know that they've often experienced, their accounts being taken down. That's hundreds of thousands of people that all of a sudden cannot be reached because the account is being censored in one shape or another. And another very, very difficult way to say that an account is being censored is shadow banning. And shadow banning happens in many shapes and forms. We see shadow banning with a reach that all of a sudden gets limited on a specific account. But there are other forms of shadow ban that happen, that are like what we want to say by design. So for example, a lot of, creators have said that they cannot hit the option of collaborating. That's something that we see very often. And then the appeal processes are often very difficult. There's no transparency and so on. So what does this do is that there is hundreds of thousands of people that often cannot get reached with the accurate information they need. Harmful and wrong information are often being circulated where accurate information is not available. And also what we know is that this perpetuates stigma, because when you have to like change the way that you spell something, right? When you want to say abortion, but then all of a sudden you have to, use Aggle speech and then change the wording, that's just perpetuating language of the oppression, and it's not okay at all. And finally, I'd say that, we're small organizations. We don't have a lot of resources. The appeal processes are very, very long, very lengthy, and often are actually, we're not getting the actual information that we need at the end of it. So there is no real, accountability from the part of big tech. And that's just when it's social media. So I'll just say very quickly that we also see this in search and Google and so on. And what often happens in that space is that there is like a bunch of fake clinics. I'm working actively, say, for example, in the state of Texas, or even in Malta, or in many places where abortion, for example, or reproductive health is heavily restricted. But what we see is that there is a bunch of like fake clinics that are showing up, and ranking first and second and third, and often in like the first 2 pages of results. And they often actually get money from, taxpayers, well, as we know that because of the legislations in many places like the US, fundings is extremely limited when it comes to reproductive health care. So, and I'll just say, because I'm working on this actively right now, that not only that, but these fake clinics are now, let's say, mutating into different names. Like, for example, now they're like the adoption centers, or like the maternal health, that there are actually fake clinics, and they take a lot of money, and they have a lot of money, and they're often like, nonprofit organizations, and they rank very high, and they're extremely harmful. So that's a bit what happens. It can be an extremely harmful actually environment, and obviously it leads to extreme stigma, and people not being able to access the care that they need. That was a long answer.
Not at all. It was a very it was a complete answer. And there's also, I mean, you mentioned stigma, and the need to euphemize things and use these euphemisms. And I wanted to get your thoughts on like because there's a huge mental health aspect to this, right? Like having to constantly call something that it's not, or also then just how this affects our perception or youth perception of bodies that are different. Like, could you imagine sex ed that actually discussed something other than cis hetero sex for the purpose of procreation? Like, what does this do to the mental health of, in particular, youth, but also just people in general who are looking for information that is either euphemized, completely lacking, or stigmatized in the sense that it's shown in a very dark light?
Yeah, I mean, there's some great studies, and I can link them to you later, but there's some great studies that show the mental health effects of being deplatformed, so your entire account being taken down, and what that means, especially when it's your livelihood. But also, to your point, like when young people are actually searching for accurate information and they cannot find this, and they have to, when it becomes a secret, and you feel like it's something that it's not correct and you shouldn't be doing it, and it's extremely harmful. And plus, when fake clinics come at you, and instead of obviously sharing accurate information how you can get care, but tell you, oh, have you thought of another alternative? This is not good. This is not bad. This is not something that you should be doing right now. The effects on youth are extremely harmful. I mean, we know that there are studies that show that about, say, 75 to 80% of youth gets their sexual and reproductive health information online. So when they have to hide it, change the way that they talk about it, not share it with others, that perpetuates stigma and creates extreme isolation, which, as you know, can link to things like, enhancing the manosphere, all this like extreme things that we see in our society when, as you know, we cannot freely speak about things that are actually in our bodily autonomy, and are actually health. And to that extent, something that we often advocate for is that reproductive health is healthcare. It should be treated as is, and it shouldn't be a political subject. Often organizations are asked to be able to show and demonstrate that they have like a political electoral kind of like certificate in order to be able to campaign or talk about reproductive health. Our content is taken down because it's politically labeled. And again, what we say is that this is actually healthcare. It should be treated as such. We've seen how, Facebook has done, for example, a much better job when it was the COVID-19 pandemic by redirecting people to accurate healthcare information. And we're asking for reproductive health to be treated as such and not to be a political issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially in the US, there's so many stories that you hear, and these are just the ones that bubble up to like a national stage. But people who die seeking basic reproductive health care, it's like these are life and death situations. They can be. And so the idea that this is, just for just for the, the depraved, or it's just if if you don't want to live a good life, it's like that is such a disgusting and patriarchal and right wing Christian way of framing things. And speaking of a right wing Christian way of framing things, I do want to talk a little bit about nuance, because this is something that also gets lost. My co-host Mickey and I often refer to nuance as one of the corpses that are being beaten by today's increasingly polarized political landscape. And so birth control. There's an interesting, also very concerning kind of horseshoe effect here, where a healthy skepticism of the pharmaceutical industry combined with legitimate frustrations with available forms of birth control, side effects, how this burden is constantly placed on women. This has led both people on the left and the right to distrust birth control and a moving away from not just birth control, but like actual science-based reproductive medicine in general. Now, as someone who personally took hormonal birth control and did not have a good time with it and is now on a non-hormonal IUD, I understand like how that pendulum swing started. The shut up and take this magical pill was met with some healthy skepticism and questions about alternatives. But the pendulum swing is now so far that we have people saying birth control is evil, saying anything but, raspberry leaf is going to kill you, we'll only do free birthing, and all kinds of wild, nonsensical ideas that ultimately harm people far more than birth control. And a 2023 study that appeared in the journal Health Communication found that 74% of YouTube influencers who spoke about birth control encouraged discontinuation of hormonal birth control. So, Martha, help us out here. Like, how can we acknowledge this nuance, and how can we really boost that critical media literacy while also accepting that, yes, big pharma has caused a lot of harm? An unfair burden is placed on people who take hormonal birth control. But also, like, there is science-backed information, and birth control can be very helpful. And like, how do you approach that nuance on something like birth control?
This is a great question. I mean, I'm thinking this out loud, but I think to me, and because we're Repro Uncensored, and it's nice not to be censored when you speak about things. And I think it's the same thing with a lot of issues, and I will answer your question. But for example, we're working a lot on the Digital Safety Act right now, and I'll tell you why this makes sense. In Europe, which basically says that whoever's information, I'm familiar with it, gets censored online, as a European citizen, you have the right to ask big tech to let you know why you were taken down, right? But this week and last week in Europe, we've seen a bunch of like anti movement, including like a bunch of like US groups that are actually trying to get rid of the DSA under freedom of speech, which obviously, we think the DSA is a great piece of legislation. We just want it to be able to work, right? So it's actually very interesting, because one has to be very careful about how you talk about these things without falling into like anti-rhetoric. So that's actually an open question that I have for you too. I think our job is to make sure that the narrative is accurate, so that we give accurate information to influencers, creators, and so on, which I think are the ones that carry the messages right now, so that they can share accurate information and be able to give weighted advice. I would say this is the most important thing. And again, I think asking for big tech to be able to direct people to the healthcare resources that they need, instead of having anyone say whatever they want. This is a healthcare thing. So this is what we often say is the same way that in other healthcare issues. We've seen, Facebook, for example, putting a little window that says this is a healthcare issue, so direct it to the WHO, World Health Organization. We're asking them to be able to do the same and direct people to the accurate information. So I think people should be able to express, issues whenever they are, especially when it comes to big pharma. But I think that they need to be given the accurate information, and so they can do that. That's what I would say. But I do think that I was just going to say, but I do think that it's important for people to be able to express their concerns, and they're valid. They just have to be accurately backed up.
Yeah, and I think like that's one of the things that we talk a lot about on the show here is like look at the source, and that storytelling is beautiful, but it doesn't equal science-backed information. So if somebody tells a story about them being harmed by birth control, it's like that's valid. That's a valid personal experience. It doesn't equal scientific information that shows how helpful birth control has been, will continue to be. And it's like, yes, there's nothing on this planet that is 100% effective, that is 100% wonderful for everyone who engages with it, right? Like even chocolate. So, I think it's important to recognize the importance of sourcing information as well.
That's right. And that's right. And I mean, we know by the researches that we've done and other colleagues have done that the algorithm often rewards negativity and extreme, speech and wording. And that's a massive issue. So if there is a responsibility for big tech, it's to make sure that the sources and the accurate healthcare information are the ones that have been provided with accurate links to them, and that they're not rewarding, negative, sensationalized conversations, which can be extremely harmful, to your point.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, like the flip side of this is that at the same time, the people who do want to access birth control are finding it more difficult than ever. And one would think, but of course, logic doesn't really play a role here. One would think if you're anti-abortion, you would want everyone to have all of the birth control because you wouldn't need to
Right.
deal with as many abortions if you made sure that people had birth control. But yeah, again, logic does not play a role here.
Yeah, it's
I
just
mean, just
sorry, I was just gonna
yeah.
say it's what often we see. I mean, what can I think quite accurately be said is that there are attempts to control, bodies, women's bodies, and so on in one shape or another. They don't always make so much sense. It's just the less options they have, the better, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's about control. I can't remember where I read this, but somebody said, rape isn't about sex, it's about power. You wouldn't hit someone with a garden shovel and call it gardening. And I really liked that comparison. But so, I mean, just as a for instance, abortion is less than 10% of what Planned Parenthood does, and I know that there are legitimate concerns about Planned Parenthood, but they do also do STI tests and breast cancer screenings and giving out information that, unlike other clinics, does not include like just praying about it. But that's just one example, and they've suffered significant funding cuts that have forced them to close dozens of clinics, and they're like a huge player on this stage. Think of what happens to like the smaller places, and I was wondering if you could actually talk about not just like access to information digitally, but access to like brick and mortar or actual places where one might go to get birth control if one actually gets the information about it and wants to access it.
Yeah, I mean, we know that there is massive cuts, like not only because of legislations, but also because of financial hardships that are affecting, exactly like the brick and mortar clinics, the birth control and abortions providers throughout the country, and it's extremely harmful, obviously, to abortion and reproductive health seekers that have to often travel now miles and miles to be able to get the care they need, if they can get it on time at all. We know that also there is a lot of financial costs and hardships to this, when someone is trying to get the care that they need and they cannot access it because it's not available in their state or in the region. And again, there is a lot of stigma associated with it, when you have to travel to another place, when you're not sure if the information and the place that you're going to is correct. That could be another barrier. All these are really, really big barriers that happen. I mean, we see what happens, for example, in Florida, where most patients have to go, for example, to New York City to get the care they need. it's horrible. There's like hundreds of thousands of people that don't get the access that they deserve, while we know that fake clinics and other, you know, formats of this are proliferating. So it's extremely problematic that the smaller groups are being closed. I mean, as much as Planned Parenthood, but are being closed because people don't get the care they need, and ultimately, we know that also there is more and more surveillance that is happening. We know that, you know, when people are trying to find the information, they're also often very, you know, skeptical of putting their information online, which they should, because we don't know where it's going to go. We know that, you know, there's a lot of criminalization that happens. So it creates an extremely harmful environment for the information seeker, and it doesn't seem that it's going to get any better anytime soon, unfortunately.
And I wanted to ask, because obviously what you do is very global, and I wanted to ask how what happens in the US or indeed in Europe, how that affects the global South in terms of access to legitimate information and indeed, you know, actual physical help.
Yeah, I think when Roe v. Wade was overturned, our experience, I mean, what we're seeing is it was a big kind of like wake up call for the US to realize that, you know, their rights are not as protected as maybe they thought they were. And you know, I think that it forced a lot of groups, or reminded a lot of groups, to look around and see what other strategies have been used by other, you know, reproductive health, abortion access groups worldwide, including in places like, for example, Brazil or Poland or Mexico, you know, which now has a pretty strong legislation when it comes to abortion. But you know, that created a lot of things like community networks in the US, for example, that are now able to deliver care and so on. And you know, communities had to become stronger in one way or another. But we're learning a lot of things, especially when it comes to circumventing and thinking of creating creative ways to rethink of information. You know, we work with a lot of partners in Senegal, for example. Senegal's second highest cause of criminalization for women is abortion care, right? But I mean, obviously they have abortions. I mean, they have them all the time. It's a matter of how, you know, you talk about them and how you can go about this on the ground, and how strong are community networks and just, you know, like other networks that exist on the ground. So I think that it forced the US to rethink their strategy when it comes to, you know, care and coming together and being creative in ways that I hadn't thought before, and also to realize their place in the global, you know, feminist and abortion and reproductive health landscape in ways that they perhaps thought they were stronger before, and they're not actually. And also in terms of the information that we do and the research that we do, there is, as you know, a lot of US policies that are impacting the way that information on reproductive health care is shared globally, you know, like, for example, because a lot of these are, as you know, big tech is based in Silicon Valley or whatever, you know, in Texas. And there is a lot of places in the world where, for example, abortion is legal, like such as Argentina, where we haven't seen anyone being able to run any Google ads, for example, because the legislations or the policies that are set up by Google are actually obeying to this US landscape. So and when there are often US policy changes, they're impacting, and we see a ripple effect throughout the world. So you know, it's by no means are we, you know, isolated in the US. We have to look a bit about other strategies worldwide, but also a lot of US policies and legal landscape is impacting organizations every day in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, borders don't matter to the corporations who who
No.
run things, so they shouldn't matter to us. And I know that because Repro Uncensored does a lot of creative work
Yeah.
on this, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like tools and tactics to get around this censorship, including, you know, creative ones that people might be able to ping off of and be inspired by.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I will ask you too. I'm sure you also have a lot of creativities as well. But you know, we try to do a lot of things like murals, for example, with like QR codes and things like this, and stickers and all that stuff. But also like things that to me destigmatize or bring reproductive health care into the mainstream, right? So like working with musicians and doing, anything that brings it into the culture mainstream, I think is important. I think we have to be everywhere. We don't have to think of this as an isolated thing. It's part of right? It's our body, so it's part of everything that we do. So I mean, I guess because I just came back from this incredible festival that I work with in Senegal, in Dakar. They're called Kimpavita, and they're this amazing Pan-African initiative, and they do an amazing festival. It's like people are happy and it's joyful, but it's also like a lot about reproductive health and feminism, in the region. So to me, that's really cool. But other things as well, like, we work with a lot of groups in Poland, for example. They will do things like write numbers of like clinics or abortion care in the sand, or, things like this that are perhaps less, big scale, but I think are very important. And then obviously working with youth as much as possible, like students, schools, and understanding where their mind is, what interests them, to me is important. I mean, I told you a bit earlier, but I do think that creators and influencers and all these people are the ones that are carrying the message. And I really think we need to work hand in hand with them and not just have them as an afterthought of, okay, this is the policy, just take it, but just include them in the way that we talk about this thing. So yeah, I think everything, like if one has the means, like, I don't know, like have a drone go around, or like go do anything, find creative ways to get the message out is important. And also it's an open conversation, about how specific you want to go with your wordings. I don't have the answer to this, but sometimes leading with what abortion could be harder in some contexts than saying leading with reproductive health information. So I think being sensitive to this context and also to the kind of legal risks that a lot of people can be put in if depending on the wording is important. As much as we want to always, be able to be vocal, I think sometimes being sensitive to the cultural and legal context is crucial, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I I oftentimes say this, the way that I talk to a group of mine workers in West Virginia is not the way that I talk to a group of anarchists in New York City, And it's not that I'm not dumbing down my message either way.
No,
I'm just
no.
speaking differently. And I think that that's important, like know your audience and understand where people are coming from. And yeah, like meeting people where they're at. It sounds cliche, but it's like I think, and when we need that too, I remember the first time somebody told me we could abolish police. I was like, hold on. And I needed
Yeah.
someone to meet me where I
Yes.
was at that point,
Yes.
and then, slowly understand the concepts of abolition as it stands. And so I
Yes.
think like that's a very important thing to do in terms of this messaging, not just because of meeting people where they're at, but obviously, as we've been talking about today, because of the extreme censorship
Yeah.
apparatus. Like we have to think creatively, because those trying to silence us are also unfortunately thinking, if not creatively, at least very oppressively.
Yeah, and they have a great budget, and they're doing a great job
Amen.
at distracting us. But yeah, I was just gonna tell you because you asked about the international context. I'm Greek, and it's a pretty religious country. However, abortion is quite accessible, actually. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of hubs of abortion, like pills and so on, that are actually based in Greece, and there's like massive tradition of also anarchism and so on. So like it's something that you get and you go on with your day, and that's it. And there's not like massive, perhaps, I mean, they happen, but it's not such a cultural thing. But people have access to it whenever they need it. So but yet it's a very religious place. So I think just being aware of this context and being able, to your point, to adapt what you say is so important, I think. So
Yeah, amen. So folks, do check out Martha's work over at reprouncensored.org. And again, you can follow them on at Repro Uncensored on Instagram. Martha, was there anything else you wanted to throw out there in the last minute that we're hanging out today?
Uh, no, I just tell you that we have the report incident tool. If anyone is getting censored, we can help them get reinstated. But we also track and monitor the landscape of censorship worldwide. So it would be extremely helpful to us if you want to report it. It can be anonymous, so we can track how much censorship is happening. Yeah.
Yes. And yeah, thank you again for the work that you do. And thank you again for
Yeah. Thanks for
sitting
having
down with
me.
us today to talk about it. Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.